All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you once again for being with us as we continue our journey through the book of Genesis. We are coming down to the end. We've got the last five chapters of the book of Genesis, and then that's it. Then we've covered we've covered all the material for this first book of the Bible, and what a book it is. Before we get into the text moving forward, today we served liturgy today at the church for the nativity of the Theotokos, the birth of the Theotokos. And I was struck as I was serving liturgy and preaching today about how the same themes of today's feast of patient endurance and faith and perseverance and prayer are common, prevalent themes in the book of Genesis. We've seen it in the person of Abraham, who waited many years for the promise, God's promise to be fulfilled. We've seen it with Jacob as he labored for 14 years so that he could marry his beloved Rachel. Now we see with Joseph, in the story of Joseph that we've been reading, Joseph toiling for many years in the prisons and waiting for, praying and waiting for patiently for that God's grace and God's providence to come through. And in all those cases, it did. Abraham gets the son that he's been waiting for. Jacob finally is able to marry Rachel, and then after more patience, she's able to bear children. And now Joseph, as we left him off, is the second in command in Egypt, and he is basically saving their whole area from destruction during the famine. And in the in the birth of the Theotokos, we see the same thing. Joachim and Anna praying for many years, waiting till their old age to have a child. And again, just like in the book of Genesis, as we've seen, God waits for the right moment. He doesn't fulfill the prayers instantly or right away or, after a certain amount of times of being asked. He waits for the right moment for the prayer to be answered. And that's what we see too in the story of the birth of the Theotokos and the story of Joachim and Anna. So I just thought, since it applied, since it's really connected to what we've been talking about these last few weeks, I would share that little thought that I had today actually I preached on that topic today as well. On this great holiday of the church, the birth of the Panagia. So with that short sidebar, we'll continue now with Genesis. So we're in chapter 46 out of 50. And if you remember from last time, the Joseph was reunited with his brothers. He lets them know that he's forgiven them and that he really sees God's providence in everything that's happened, them selling him into Egypt, his time in the prisons, his ascension to being the number two in Egypt. Now to be able to save lives and to be able to keep his family alive, because really it's his family that would have perished in the famine had he not been there in that position. And now he has sent them back to Judah to get their father Jacob and to bring him also to Egypt so that they can live and thrive and survive and thrive in Egypt, because that's where the food is. That's where they have food to take care of everybody. So that's where we left off, with all the sons of Jacob now traveling back to Judah to get their father. So in chapter 46, we begin, "Now Israel took his journey with all he had and came to the well of Oath and offered a sacrifice to the God of his father Isaac." And so we see once again in this family genealogy that an important crossroads, at important stops, at the beginning of important journeys and important times in their lives, they stop and they offer sacrifice to God. And again, sacrifice, especially whole burnt sacrifices, was an act of submission to the will of God. It was an act of total obedience and humility before God. And so they begin, Jacob here begins his journey to Egypt with this sacrifice, with this understanding that he is submitting himself to God's will and he is putting himself in God's hands. And we've seen that really throughout Genesis. Noah, when he comes out of the ark, he offers a sacrifice. Abraham many times offered sacrifices. So it's that common theme now comes back to show us how we should begin, major life events, how we should begin major life journeys, always submitting ourselves to the will of God. In verse 2, then God spoke to Israel in a vision of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. So he said, here I am. So God said to him, I am the God of your fathers. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Then Jacob arose from the well of Oath, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob, their baggage, and their wives in the carts Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So they took their livestock and their goods which they had acquired in the land of Canaan and went to Egypt, Jacob and all his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons, his daughters, his sons' daughters, and all his seed he brought with him to Egypt. So the whole family comes with. It's not just Jacob or Jacob and, you know, some servants. He brings the whole family with. And actually, we won't read through these next couple of sections here. They're just genealogies. And really, it's just a list of everybody that came with to Egypt. But in verse 27, it gives us the final head count. It says, the sons of Joseph born to him in the land of Egypt were 9. Thus, all the souls of Jacob's house who went to Egypt were 75. So now we have 75 people that are traveling through really desert terrain. I mean, would have been difficult traveling. And that journey is about 2 weeks. It's about a 2 week travel, depending on where they're going in Egypt. It hasn't, as far as I have seen, it hasn't really specified necessarily where they're going in Egypt, but it's at least a 2 week journey. It may be longer because you have women, you have children. Jacob is an old man. He's probably only able to do so much traveling in one day. So it would have been a difficult journey there. Now, what's interesting from this vision that Jacob has is, first of all, we have Jacob first offering sacrifice and submission to God, and then God appears to him in a vision and reassures him, right? So Jacob puts himself in God's hands, and God reassures him and says, yes, go down to Egypt. Don't be afraid. I'm going down there with you. But then God makes a point here to say, I will also surely bring you up again. So this is a reiteration that Egypt is not their homeland. That's not the land that's been promised to them. They're going there out of necessity to survive the famine, but the time will come for them to come back to Canaan, and God will lead them out of Egypt and bring them back. And we'll see now how the book of Genesis sets up the next book of the Torah, which is the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, which is the book of Exodus, the story of Moses and the Israelites leaving Egypt and coming out and going through their 40 years in the desert, and then finally coming to the promised land. So we have kind of that first hint there that they're going to go and eventually they're going to come back. Now, a lot happens in between then. We'll get to that in the final chapters of Genesis, but it's something to keep in your mind as we read ahead in the book, is that this book now is setting up Exodus. It's setting up the Moses story and the return from Egypt. So as I said, we're going to skip ahead now to verse 28, which is the triumphant scene of Joseph and Jacob finally being reunited. So in verse 28, we read, now he sent Judah before him to Joseph, that he might meet him in Goshen, in the land of Ramses. So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. And he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept a good while. So Jacob sends Judah on ahead to tell Joseph that he's ready to meet him. And they finally meet, they embrace, and they weep. They weep. Jacob, you can imagine Jacob so many years believing his son had been killed by a wild animal and that he had died this brutal death, to find out then that his son, after years and years and years, that his son is alive. At least 15 years has passed at this time, that his son is alive, and now they're finally face to face, embracing one another again. And Joseph, the same thing. You imagine all those nights in the prisons, all those nights that he would have been alone, totally isolated from his family, now to be reunited with the father who loves him. would have been a very powerful and emotional thing, and so they weep. It shows their humanity and shows that they're the emotion, the natural human emotion that they would have had in that moment. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Now let me die in peace, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive." Joseph then said to his brothers, "I will go up and tell Pharaoh and say to him, 'My brothers and those of my father's house who were in the land of Canaan have come to me. But the men are shepherds, for they are pastoral men, and they have brought their flocks, their herds, and all they have. So it shall be when Pharaoh calls you and says, 'What is your occupation?' that you shall say, 'Your servants are pastoral men from our youth, even till now, both we and also our fathers, that you may dwell in the land of Goshen in Arabia. For every shepherd is an abomination to the Egyptians.'" So Joseph is preparing them for their meeting with Pharaoh so that they can get the best land for their flocks, for their families. Because for shepherds to be in Egypt was, as it says here, an abomination. So they're not gonna they're not gonna do well necessarily in certain parts there. But Goshen would be a great place for them to be because it has plenty of land for their herds and their flocks and all that stuff. So Joseph is telling them now, he's preparing them for that meeting so they can become established and do well in Egypt, because they're not just coming just to scrape by. They're coming to to thrive, and to become a great nation, as God has said earlier in this chapter. So Joseph now is taking the necessary steps to make that happen. And we'll see again, we see again and again now how God's providence really guides this family, the Israelites, to always do well wherever they go. And even when they find themselves in difficult positions, in difficult situations, they find a way to thrive. They find a way to overcome. Joseph in the prisons again, becoming the second in command in Egypt. Now we'll see the Israelites going from starving in Canaan now to being to getting the best of the land in Egypt and becoming a great nation there, and really becoming a group that eventually will be feared, and that's why they eventually find themselves as slaves in Egypt as well. So we make our way now to chapter 47, where we see Joseph's plan now for his family kind of comes to fruition. Now Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and brothers, their flocks and their herds and all they possess have come from the lands of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen." So he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph's brothers, "What is your occupation?" So they said to Pharaoh, "Your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers." They also said to Pharaoh, "We have come to dwell in the land because your servants have no pasture for their cattle, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen." So they asked for this land that Joseph told them, this is where this would be a good spot for you guys to land. So they asked for it. Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. If you know of capable men among them, make them overseers of my cattle." So he actually tells Joseph that, if they're capable, they should be in charge of my cattle too. So he actually gives them immediately, he gives them a position of authority to be, the royal shepherds, and herdsmen, so to speak. So again, they find themselves in this new country with no, I mean, Joseph is their connection, but with no established, presence in that area. And immediately they find themselves, doing just fine. Thus Jacob and his sons came to Egypt, and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, heard about it. So Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, "Your father and brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land." So again, the best, right? No matter where they go, the Israelites, they find themselves in the best. Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourn are 130 years. Few and evil have they been, but they have not attained to the days and years of my father's sojourn in life." So at this point in his life, we see Jacob is now 130 years old. So he is an old man. He's at the end of his time. He's at the end of his journey. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before him, which again shows how much respect this family has in the eyes of Pharaoh, obviously through Joseph, that Joseph has done this great service to the Egyptians and really saving them through this famine. But for Pharaoh now, a king, one of the most powerful men in the world, to meet this little old man from Canaan and to ask for his blessing shows the respect that Jacob and his family commanded at that time, and uh, and shows the good nature of this Pharaoh. In contrast to what we'll see at the end of the book with the next Pharaoh that comes along, is not so good natured, and he's definitely not uh, well disposed towards the Israelites. So we're in verse 10 now of chapter 47. So Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before him. Thus Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and his father's household with bread according to the number of individual persons. So he settles them in. He's able to. It's like the final act that Joseph does for his family to save them is he's able to now settle them in Egypt. He provides bread for them and gives them life. That bread is symbolic of life. Just like in the liturgy we have bread, we have bread as the gift offered, which will be transformed into the body of Christ. That bread is symbolic of life itself. It's a staple food. When it's transformed into the body of Christ, it's the food of eternal life, not just earthly life, but eternal life. So here, Joseph providing bread for his family is again it's a typology of Christ, who will eventually offer his own flesh and blood to all of us so that we can live forever. Now Joseph offers physical bread, material bread to his father and his brothers so that they can live and survive in Egypt. Jesus eventually will come and will offer his body and blood on the cross for us to eat, in Holy Communion and live eternally. So we have again another connection here between Joseph and Jesus, again just to hammer home that point of the typology of how when we read the story of Joseph, we see foreshadowing of the story of Jesus, and when we read the Gospels, if we're familiar with these passages, our mind will immediately go to them. Our mind will immediately come back now to Genesis and say, that's like Joseph. This is like, they, again, when the Jews living in that time saw what was happening, their minds should have gone to these stories that are so critical to their understanding of themselves. They should have known what they were seeing. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But the typology is there nonetheless. So we move forward now, verse 13. Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe, and both the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were devastated by the famine. So Joseph gathered up all the money found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, for the grain they bought, and he doled out to them. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Thus, when the money ran out in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For our money has run out." Then Joseph said, "Bring your cattle, and I will give you bread for them, if your money has run out." So they brought their cattle to Joseph, and he gave them bread in exchange for their horses, sheep, oxen, and donkeys. Thus he fed them with their bread that year in exchange for all their cattle. So this gives us some detail as to how Joseph is going to deal with the famine and provide food for everybody. He basically sets up an exchange system, and it says, "Okay, we have plenty of bread. We have, the king's treasury is stocked. Um, so when when economically the people start running out of money and running out of provisions, they come to Joseph, and he's able to say, okay, bring your cattle, bring whatever you have, and we'll give you bread so that you can eat and survive." And so that whole year, this is what they're doing. He's accepting their trades, so to speak. He's making trades with them. And in the end, they're getting bread and they're surviving the famine. When that year ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord that our money has run out, and my lord also has our possessions and cattle. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. Why should we die therefore before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be your servants of Pharaoh." Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. So the following year comes, and the people are in no better shape because the famine is so horrible. So they say, okay, we have nothing left except ourselves and our lands. Take whatever we have, we'll be your servants, and feed us so that we don't die. What's the point of dying? What's the point of dying hungry but free? So they offer their lands, and they offer themselves as servants. So Joseph bought all the land of the Egyptians for Pharaoh. For every man of the Egyptians sold his land to Pharaoh because the famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. Now as for the people, he moved them into the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to all the Egyptians, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. Then it shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own, as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your households. So they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. Then Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day that Pharaoh should have 1/5, except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So in this second year, he claims all the lands for Pharaoh. They sell the lands to Pharaoh. He gives them seed. So basically, they set up a system where the people will work the land. Pharaoh will get 20%, and they will keep the rest of it. So, and they agree. So the land is now no longer theirs, but the land will be theirs to work, and what doesn't belong to them. And they will give 20% of their crops to Pharaoh, and the rest they'll be able to keep. And they're very grateful for that and say, you have saved our lives. So again, we have this imagery of salvation. We have this imagery of redemption out of a difficult desperation, out of death itself. So Joseph is able to, work it out with the people they where they're able to survive this horrible famine. So in verse 27, so Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and they acquired possessions, there and increased and multiplied exceedingly. Now Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So he got there, he was 130, then he lives another 17 years. So he's 147 years old. Thus, when the time drew near for Jacob to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if I have found grace in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and deal with me in mercy and truth. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place. So he said, I will do as you say. Then he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the top of his staff. So Jacob here is making his burial arrangements. He tells Joseph, I don't want to be buried here. Again, even though he had been there for 17 years, it reiterates the point once again. This is not the homeland of the Israelites. This is a temporary stopping point, that the day will come for them to go back to the land of their fathers, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and which again sets us up for the book of Exodus. So Joseph agrees. He agrees that when Jacob leaves this life, that he'll take him back and bury him among his fathers. So now we get to see, in these last few chapters, we get to see a depiction of some customs, some rites, some traditions of what the heads of households would be doing at the time of their death, as they were approaching death. We see Jacob now. He's at the end of his days. He's full of years. He has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, many possessions. His people are doing well in Egypt, and the time has come now for him to do his thing at the end of his life, to make his final preparations, say his goodbyes, and offer his blessings. So we talked about this a little bit with Israel, with Isaac, with Jacob and Esau, birthrights and giving blessings. So now we get to see this again here with Jacob as well. So in chapter 48, and this will be the last chapter we cover for today, and then next week we'll do chapter 49, 50, and we'll kind of wrap up everything. So in chapter 48, we'll see now Jacob begins to bless his family. Now it came to pass after these things that Joseph was told, "Indeed, your father is sick." And he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and went to Jacob. Thus Jacob was told, "Look, your son Joseph is coming to you." And Israel strengthened himself and sat up on his bed. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "My God appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me, and said to me, Behold, I will increase and multiply you, and I will make of you a gathering of nations, and give this land to your seed after you as an everlasting possession." So even at 147 years old, Jacob recalls and reminds his son Joseph of the promise that God had made him when he was a young man, that the land of Canaan will be theirs, and that they will be a great nation there. Now, therefore, your two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. So Jacob basically is saying there that your sons are, I will treat them like my sons, because Reuben and Simeon are sons of Jacob himself. Your offspring, whom you beget after them, shall take possession of their inheritance within the tribes of their brothers. But as for me, when I came from Mesopotamia of Syria, excuse me, I'm hungry. Mesopotamia of Syria, Rachel died beside me in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Then Israel saw Joseph's sons, and said, Who are these with you? So Joseph said to his father, They are my sons God gave me here. Jacob then said, Bring them to me that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim by reason of old age, and he could not see. Then Joseph brought them near, and he kissed and embraced them. Then Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see your face, but in fact God has also shown me your seed. So Joseph brought them from beside his knees, and they bowed down with their face to the ground. Then Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh with his left hand towards Israel's right hand, and brought them near him. Thus Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. Then he blessed them and said, so here again we have a blessing being given to the sons of Joseph, who, even though Joseph is not the eldest brother by any means, he is the son of all the sons. He was the beloved because he was of Rachel, and also because he's the most virtuous and wise of all the sons. So now his sons are getting blessed by Jacob, who's treating them as his own offspring. God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac were well pleasing, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day, the angel who redeemed me from all evils, bless these lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a great multitude in the midst of the earth. So Jacob now blesses them, that God will look upon them, and that he will look upon them just as he does Abraham and Isaac, and now Jacob, who will soon be added to his fathers as well. It's interesting that when the Israelites come out of Egypt and they begin to settle in the promised land, the 12 tribes of Israel, they all settle in different areas. And so the tribes are named after the different sons of Jacob, but two of the tribes actually take these names of these two boys here, the grandsons of Jacob. So of Ephraim and Manasseh are actually two of the tribes of Israel. So it goes to show that this blessing, it sticks, that God does bless them, that their offspring become tribes of equal importance and of equal stature with the other brothers of Jacob. So there's no tribe of Joseph, but there are tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. So the blessing here As we say in Greek, from your mouth to God's ears. Uh, God hears this blessing in this prayer, and he does indeed bless Joseph's two sons. Now, when Joseph saw his father put his right hand on the hand of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took hold of his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. So Joseph said to his father, Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head. But his father refused and said, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be exalted. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. So we have again this theme of the younger brother surpassing the older brothers. And it's funny because Jacob, of course, took the birthright of his brother Esau, which was a whole big drama as well. And then, then Joseph, of course, kind of ascends to over all of his brothers, even though they're older than him. And so now the time comes for Jacob to bless Joseph's sons, his grandsons. It's almost fitting that he chooses the younger to put his right hand on, as opposed to the older one. Even in the church today, the right hand has significance and really, I don't know what the right word is, but it has preference over the left hand. Probably going back to the 25th chapter of Matthew, where God separates the sheep and the goats, and the sheep are on the right hand of God, and the goats are on the left hand of God. The priest always blesses with his right hand. Uh, when the priest lifts up the gifts from the table, the right hand is always over the left hand. At baptism services, when the oil is placed in the hands of the godparents, it's always right hand over left hand, etc., etc. So even now, going back, if we're reading this chapter, going back all the way to this time, thousands of years before Christ, the right hand was the hand of blessing. Was of the most blessing. So in this story, Jacob puts his right hand on the younger son, and his left hand on the older son. Joseph tries to switch them, and he says, no, not so. And again, it's almost fitting because that's really the whole story of their whole family, that the younger is always surpassing the older, even though legally and traditionally the birthright would have been theirs. So let's finish off chapter 48 then, and we'll call it a night. So we're in verse 20 now. So he blessed them that day, saying, by you Israel will be blessed, saying, my God, make you as Ephraim and as Manasseh. Thus he set Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, behold, I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers. So Jacob here passes along the note. He passes along the memo, so to speak, to Joseph, that the time will come one day when God will bring them out of Egypt. Moreover, I have given to you one portion above your brothers. I am giving you Shechem, which I took from the land of the Amorites with my sword and bow. So once again, Jacob gives priority to his younger son. He gives him this extra blessing above the other sons as a final gift to him. Shechem is a city in the ancient world. And so he says, that city will belong to you. I had captured it who knows how many years before, and it will belong to you as opposed to your brothers. So with that, we'll stop for the night. We have 2 chapters left. We'll see. We really basically have the Jacob's final words, and then his death and burial, and then again the setup for as we move from Genesis into the book of Exodus. So that's what. And then after that, after we get through the last 2 chapters, we'll take a kind of one more broad look at the whole book in its entirety. Take some take-home points and themes. And then we will, that'll be the conclusion for our Bible study on the book of Genesis. So if there's any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. If not, we'll break for the evening, and then we'll finish off next week, the book of Genesis. All right, seeing no questions, you are dismissed. Depart in peace, not in pieces, as my seminary professors used to say. Thank you again for being with us, and God willing, we'll see you next week as we conclude our Bible study. Thank you. God bless and have a good night.